All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with us today. We're grateful for the opportunity to join you all and share a bit of our humanizing brand experience results. Um, we have spoken to many organizations across the country in healthcare specifically about this work. And I think there was some interest, it sounded like, for this group to dig a little bit deeper into the insights. My name is Justin Wartell. I'm one of the principals at Monocle. We're a brand experience agency with offices in Colorado and in New York. I'm based in very sunny Golden, Colorado. We will share a little bit more about our background as we jump into this study. We'll tell you about ourselves. We'll tell you a little bit about the work that you're going to see here. Then we'll jump into the content itself and talk through the executive summary of the six annual iteration of our Humanizing Brand Experience report. This is being recorded, so everybody will have access to it based on the webinar structure here within Zoom. Questions will need to come through the chat. So if you do have any questions, which I'm happy to address as we're going through, or if you have any comments or places where you want to go a little bit deeper, please do feel free to drop those questions into the chat. I'll do my best to keep an eyeball on those questions, and then we will get them addressed. Some we might cover live, some we could do as follow-ups, others might be later on in the presentation. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started, knowing that we only have, about 250 slides here to share with you. Just kidding, of course. So want to put this work into broader Monocle context. So as we mentioned, we're a brand experience company. So our work is helping organizations, about half of whom are in healthcare and half of whom are outside of it, to understand who they are as organizations and how do they create brand and experience around that idea of what they stand for. So at our core, and what you're going to hear a lot about today, is our insights work. We have a behavioral insights team that does nothing but work to better understand humans. The question then is, what do you do with that knowledge? And that'll be the part today where you start to think about hopefully some of the way that these insights and these opportunities might impact your brands, the cultures of your organizations, and then the experiences that you create as well. What we wrap around that, at least from a Monocle perspective, is an orientation to getting this work or this thinking into the real world via activation, management of brand to ensure that we're making an impact, that we're appropriately governing brand, that we're thinking about guidelines, training, and education so that everyone is on the same page, and ultimately making a big picture impact. As we get into humanizing brand experience, this is a study that, as we mentioned, is now in its sixth year. We collect data annually, and we always collect our data in November, December of the previous calendar year. So this report was published, well, it's June now, so last month. It was published in May. The data we collected was from December and November of 2022. So as you look back across the 6 years, that pattern continues. So the 25,000 consumers we spoke to all provided this data in the back end of calendar year 2022. So everything tagged as volume 6 in this report is from that time period. I think it's always a challenge for us talking to so many people to get to then what is something we could describe at the core here, an overall theme. I think the interesting part and the biggest challenge I think that many of us are facing, you all probably face it every single day as well, is that people continue to be less and less engaged with healthcare. There isn't something that's re-sparking their interest. And that applies not just to consumers, but in this challenging and volatile labor environment, it's also from our cultures as well when we think about our employees. So we think about our role, how do we make a more human impact? That's really the core question driving a lot of the thinking here. We're all trying to build and rebuild human connections after the volatility of the pandemic, especially probably magnified by it. The question is, how do we really establish or reestablish that human impact? A lot of what we'll talk about today across the 12 chapters that we have to share with you is all about understanding what people want in building that more human relationship, and then ultimately getting them the insight that they need in order to make better and stronger relationships with us. So across these chapters, we're going to start broad. We're going to talk about consumer engagement. Then we're going to get much more specific into its different facets, looking from different vantage points, thinking about consumer, thinking about employee, the impact of employee on consumer. And ultimately, we'll land on our brand framework with the priorities of which are about which are most important to our consumers. And then we'll talk about the rankings just to give you a sense of what are the outcomes of the report, and we'll then talk key takeaways. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll do our best to address them. Also, if you have any perspective or feedback on go a little faster, a little less detail, or you want to hear more, please feel free to drop that into the chat. Very open to feedback. All right, so let's dig into chapter one. We started our introduction here around healthcare engagement and its stagnancy. Let us show you exactly what we mean. We've been collecting a series of what we call category engagement drivers since we started this study. And tracking back to 2020, which again, if you think about 2020 data, that would have been November, December 2019. That's pretty clearly pre-pandemic. And what you see is as we move into whatever we call the time we're in now, people have been pretty consistently less engaged with not a lot of change in that level of engagement from 2021 up to now in 2023. So it's interesting when you aggregate the perspective of all of our consumers across the US, how consistent these numbers have been. Probably more important and more helpful is how we start to look at the specific measures that we are using. So these are the category engagement measures specifically that roll up to the overall score that we were showing on the previous page. And what you can see is while there's a little bit of an change from a proactivity perspective, what's really interesting to see is how much something like control, which in the way that we ask it is a question of trust, continues to deteriorate. Influence and advocacy, kind of the social currency around healthcare, continuing to deteriorate as well. Really only a little bit of improvement to a couple of attributes around personal goal setting and proactivity. So with that in mind, let's look at a couple of specific areas where we've seen the biggest dips. So when you think about consumers and their interest in watching or reading about health and wellness topics, trying new approaches to their health, or people who view themselves as that singular source of truth, that go-to for advice, those are all elements that have become less important to people, which indicates a lower level of engagement year over year. So why does engagement matter? And again, starting very big and broad, right? This is not about any one specific brand. This is about how people interact with the category. The idea here around why this matters is that if we have an audience of people that are very engaged in the category, as communicators, as marketers, as brand people, our job is then to communicate why we're special. But if we're in a position where people are less engaged in the category, they don't need to yet know why we're special because they're so far afield from it. So instead, less engaged folks, we as marketers and brand people, as communicators, we have to first get them closer to the category before we can even think about telling them why we're different. So it starts to influence the tactics, the priorities that we might be thinking about relative to our own activities. The other consideration that's especially interesting to us is how varied category engagement is across the country. So we know that many of you all are in New England, and there is a number of markets that are represented here. We collect data nationally, and that's what was reported in the previous pages. This is for market specifics where we have collected data and evaluated brands. Miami is a very interesting market. It's always the most engaged market across the country. It was surprising a bit to us that this year, 2 new markets into our study, because we're always adding markets year over year. We're up to, I think, 60 or so markets, 60 plus markets across the country. But Gainesville and Charleston were also both very engaged markets. But you can see that the variability runs from a score of 126 at the top as the most engaged market down to, I don't know if anybody's on the phone from Maine, but Maine is the least engaged healthcare market across the country, and it continues to soften over time. So again, the importance of this is to consider how we tactically engage people around the category in our brands. If we have a group of people that are less engaged, we're in a position where we have to do almost different work in comparison with other brands because we're in a position where folks just aren't as interested in the category and aren't open to hear a message of differentiation. So as we mentioned, one of the category engagement attributes that has deteriorated most significantly is around control or trust. If you think about the specific language and the attribute that we evaluate. And so the way to think about this number is we're asking, I don't always trust my healthcare provider to make the right decisions for me. And that is going up. So I don't trust is increasing. So that's a bit of a way to interpret this data. And you're seeing that this is picking up compared to the past. And in fact, the distrust is higher than it was even pre-COVID. What might be also interesting to see, but not surprising, I think about um, one of my kids who was in this earliest age group and how he thinks about the healthcare category. Most younger people have the least amount of trust in healthcare. So that orientation to not trusting is highest among those youngest audiences. We do get a lot of pushback when we think about audience age distribution because these younger audiences are challenging to prioritize. Oftentimes, we're not thinking about this youngest group. I think what's interesting for us is given how people are engaging in healthcare differently nowadays, we're not going to have the runway that we historically had for people really 45 plus, where we have the opportunity to bring them in and to build that trust over time. We're not going to have that window in the same way that we had for these younger people. So it does put a little bit more pressure from our perspective on thinking about building relationships with these younger people because our opportunities to influence them are going to continue to be pressured and less frequent as we grow. So let's look then at what contributes to trust. Our team ran an analysis that looked at the other attributes in our study and their relationship or impact on trust. And you can see these organized by their highest or strongest correlation listed on the page. Trust comes from people. If you look at the first and the third most strongly correlated attributes here, people that clearly care about the work that they do and treats employees with respect. Those are two things that build trust for consumer audiences. Self-care is an interesting one when you look at that particular attribute. Second most influential on trust, and this surprises some people because the idea here is that empowering me as a consumer with information and resources so that I can do things independently is actually something that builds trust in a healthcare brand. Doing things on my own builds trust in a healthcare brand so that when I need to work, collaborate, book an appointment with, the level of with which we've engaged people and empowered them will increase the feelings of trust that they have for the organization. And you can see the rest of the attributes here. So if you think about, as you all know, you're expert communicators and marketers. You can't just tell people you're trustworthy, right? Trust comes from action. This is the action that needs to be taken in order to build trust. So if trust is a topic your organization's been batting around, this would be the way to build a little bit stronger credibility around trust. There are a couple of places throughout the study where we have listed the brands that are strongest on these particular attributes. In this case, this is the trust attribute. And you can see probably some expected brands here, the Northwesterns, Mayos, Hopkins of the world. University of Iowa Healthcare is an interesting one. It's a new entrant to the study this year. Incredibly strong performing brand for those who have looked at the rankings already. You also, though, do see that it's not just academics on this list, although there's a disproportionate number of them. So something to think about around the potential relationship between academic medicine and trust as evident by this list. Um, just take a pause here in case there are any questions. So chapter 3 in our story here is about systemness, and systemness is such an interesting topic. We've been beating the systemness drum for quite some time, probably not that we had a crystal ball, but it was something that we saw, especially from an internal perspective, incredible benefits for how brands are governed and managed, especially as we increase our scale and our reach. But systemness continues to shift and almost takes on an amorphous quality in the minds of many of our consumers. We continue to ask a question around people's preferences for types of services, call them channels for the sake of differentiating them from what's on the next page. And we ask people to describe, would they rather get this, in this case, the first line, hospital services from a system, from an independent, or they're neutral and they don't care. What's interesting is we saw this dip happen kind of pre-COVID into COVID, where systems got somewhat of a bad rap because of some perceptions, both real and just perceived, that or some associations, both real and perceived, that they weren't doing what was in the best interest of their audiences through COVID. But that has started to improve, and you see that improvement happening, not yet to pre-COVID levels, but generally people prefer their types of care from systems versus independents. And this trend continues when you start to get to the specific service line. So if you think about cancer care, specialty care, neuro, et cetera, these are all places where people would prefer to get their care from a system in comparison with an independent or being neutral about it. When you think about the ways that systems are conveying to people why it's better for them and ultimately claiming that leadership role, the notion is convenience, both again real and perceived, because there are places where systems do it much better than independent organizations or smaller, more singular or single location organizations. But then also the centralization of things that then saves time, and often the idea of saving energy, if you think about not having to repeat your medical history, for example, or if physicians know one another and can communicate effectively with one another. So these are the two things that really stand out. In addition, we started to dig a little bit more deeper into the why here. And you can see some of the more specific quotes that consumers are talking about relative to the benefit of systemness and how they prioritize things like having a wide range of staff, more collaboration and communication, and then better resources and technology. It starts to demonstrate the more functional benefits that they believe they could accrue or generate from a healthcare system. Not always delivered, but the expectations that are created. We had an interesting conversation that continues to shift our own definition and thinking around systemness. As part of the report this year, we worked with a variety of our clients to talk about their perspectives on these chapter themes. Speaking to Sarah Sanders, who is the Chief Marketing and Brand Experience Officer at UCSF Health, which is out in San Francisco, it was interesting because she talked about systemness in a very different way. Systemness for UCSF is how they build partnerships out in the community. It's not about top-down, kind of monolithic, brand consistent systemness in the way that many organizations approach it. Instead, systemness is around how you build the right kinds of partnerships that continue to extend the reach of the organization. We thought that was quite interesting, and it teed up a question that we're now posing to many of our clients in healthcare around what is our flavor of systemness? We can talk about systemness in many different ways, but what is the benefit that we want to provide internally when we think about ourselves as an employer, but also out to our consumers as well? So some interesting kind of stretching of the thinking based on some of the discussion that we had with Sarah. Another topic, as we think about this healthcare study, 85% of it is baked, and we ask the same questions every year. That's how you do longitudinal quantitative research. But then we've got a little bit of flexibility. One area that we explored with that flexibility section here was about loyalty. We hear a lot of our clients talk about, well, how do we build loyalty-esque programs, maybe being inspired by other categories or industries? How do we build something that rewards loyalty in the healthcare space? So we started just by asking people about their interest in a loyalty program, just so you can get a sense of the distribution of responses. And as you can see, it's quite varied, but there is at least a portion of our U.S. population, somewhere in the 37, 38% range at the top, that would be interested in something like this. But what are they really looking for? And so we started to evaluate more specifically in an open-ended question, what are the things that they might expect to see from a loyalty program, given their experiences in other categories? And one of the things that it comes down to very directly is the notion of discounts and savings. How do we put dollars back into people's hands? You see that basically across the top three, and even in the fourth one, when you think about how people might redeem their points. This is going to be very much driven by experiences in other categories. And as you all know, because you're in it every single day, healthcare is a very different kind of category, and we don't have control over price in the same way. So it does start to influence it. If people have an expectation around kind of dollars, price, cashback, discounts, and we don't have control of that in the same way that a hospitality brand, a travel brand, even a grocery brand does, how do we think about loyalty in this context? We went a little bit deeper, and we asked what aspects of a program might create a higher level of loyalty for you very specifically. Top of this list that was selected was a free annual wellness checkup, extended hours for members, a fast track system to book appointments. So if you think about how we build loyalty, if we can make people feel like they get some sort of functionally beneficial attribute, like extended hours, like the ability to book appointments sooner, something that makes them feel special. And you think about how we engage with many of the loyalty programs that we have, that unexpected reward, that access to a customer service representative, that special treatment is why our loyalty remains. People are looking for the same thing from us. So you start to look at a dedicated phone number for members or for folks that are participants in our loyalty program. That could create a higher level of loyalty if we can deliver it. So interesting to look across this spectrum, especially when you think about that there are things on here that are much easier to operationalize than others. The next chapter that we wanted to talk a little bit about was this orientation to continuing to push back against healthcare and healthcare usage, and more specifically, the growth of the doctor dodger. Now, who is a doctor dodger, you might ask? We have done a segmentation as part of this research over the last couple of years, and Dr. Dodger is one of our segments. So we'll talk to you a little bit about that point going forward. So let's look at a macro level. If we think about changes in healthcare attitudes overall, we've got more and more people saying that they only go to the doctor when they're sick. We're having less proactivity when it comes to people managing their health. We have more people saying that they avoid going to the doctor even when they need to, and more they don't have time to go to the doctor. So the pressures that people are feeling relative to their engagement in healthcare are only getting worse. And this delaying of participation in our category is driven by a whole variety of things. Remember, we talked a little bit already around the lack of control we have over the cost side or the price side of this discussion. But if you think about attributes that might be delaying care, that might represent why people are delaying care, they are things that we control. So if you think about people not liking going to the doctor, difficulty getting an appointment, not enough time, we can make the experience better for people in terms of going to the doctor. We can make getting an appointment easier. we can try to find ways to make it more efficient, so that people don't have to necessarily spend time away. So it's something to think about as we look at the reasons that people are delaying care, um, that would cause us to think about, how do we improve our experience to make these delayed care reasons less of an impediment to people, um, less of an impediment to people delaying their care. Let's now look at that segmentation that we were mentioning, to you all. We do an attitudinal and behavioral segmentation. And so, what that means is that we segment people not based on their demographics, but instead based on their attitudes and their behaviors. So, if you think about attitudes and behaviors, what it does is it helps to group people based on a more, um, kind of a mindset that they have toward healthcare, not whether they're of a similar or of a um, certain household income or certain gender, for example. And if we introduce quickly these segments to you, we have our wellness influencers. These are the trendsetter individuals that really define how people kind of start to engage with the category. Let's call them the early adopters. We have the habitual strugglers, a group of people that, um, generally have chronic conditions. They're in and out of doctor's office, which is stressful and overwhelming, and they just can't seem to get ahead of things. This is very much in contrast, excuse me, with the positive preventatives. That's a group of people that, generally think about health and life in a with a very optimistic outlook, and generally use healthcare with a positive orientation and mindset. Whole health managers are typically, running households and thinking about how they manage their own care as well as that of a small or ever growing group of people. Trusting traditionalists are the bread and butter for healthcare. These are folks that appreciate the category, have frequently engaged with the category. We've built strong, trusted relationships with them. Then we have the unapologetically unhealthy, which is a new segment that emerged post COVID that illuminated a group of people that say, look, I just am not interested in health. It's not part of what's a priority for me. And then lastly are the Dr. Dodgers. And this is the group of people that are most likely, to not participate in healthcare overall. Now, what's interesting is that Dr. Dodger population is the group that has grown most year over year. We saw some pretty steady increases in the proportion of the population that was representative of those healthcare influencers, that we mentioned. But actually, that group has declined, and Dr. Dodgers has picked up the slack. And you can see that, on this particular chart, an increase in 6 points to being 17% of the total population today. Habitual strugglers are also a group that have increased, and you can imagine that probably connection not being too terribly surprising when you think about the frequency with which people have delayed care. So, as you think about the market that you operate within, you can see across the country where most Dr. Dodgers can be found, and or specifically markets where Dr. Dodgers are more common. Virginia, South Bend, Charlotte, Iowa, New Orleans, Sacramento, Salt Lake City, San Antonio, St. Louis, all being the places with the highest proportions of Dr. Dodgers, interestingly enough. Another flex question that we wanted to explore, we are spending so much time with our clients and increasingly with leaders in HR, because much of the work that we're doing is a collaboration between marketing leaders and HR leaders, because there's such a similar, set of challenges faced in marketing and marketing to employees, marketing to consumers and marketing to employees. So what we wanted to ask was whether any of the issues associated with workforce and culture and employee engagement, were any of those issues also impacting then consumer perspectives or consumer perceptions? And the short and very quick answer is yes. We're looking at 76% of US consumers that believe that healthcare organizations need more staff. 72% of consumers that think there's a staffing shortage in healthcare right now. And similarly, 72% of consumers who think healthcare professionals need to be treated better by the organizations that they work for. We'll call your attention for a moment back to that discussion of trust. If you recall, one of the most important attributes in driving trust, the strongest correlated attribute, was consumers' belief that healthcare organizations were treating their staff with respect. So when you think about this, the workforce challenges have now bled into consumer experience. The first couple of attributes that you see on this next page are the same three that we shared on the previous page. We'll just call your attention to the other attributes that were mentioned. People feeling sorry for healthcare staff, but needing better quality staff at a time when we're already seeing an exodus of people, especially from key specialized fields. It being harder to get appointments because of staffing shortages, and then quality deteriorating because of it as well. So when we think about our workforce challenges are experience challenges. They are brand challenges. They are marketing challenges because right now, whether it's perception or reality, it is causing people to believe that they are not getting what they need or should have from healthcare brands, as evident here. So as we think about our ever-changing role, not to pile on each of your plates, but the reality is that if we don't take a more proactive role in recruitment, retention, workforce culture, we are limiting the effectiveness that many of our HR colleagues are having in the work that they are doing as well. We're storytellers. That's what you all are great at, and enabling others to tell great stories is an incredible path to helping to try to address some of these workforce challenges. So what do consumers do about it? One of the things that we see here is that more people are trying to treat issues themselves. They're continuing to delay getting healthcare at a time where we need them to come in. We want them to come in. They used an alternative path like an urgent care instead, or they're going out of their way because there's something that's beneficial to them. So it's interesting to see, and you can hear very directly through the voice of our consumer audiences there on the right, that there are some incredible challenges or implications if we can't get these workforce challenges addressed. So how do you help your organization improve it? We've tried as best we can throughout to be more specific or more precise in teeing up activities that y'all could take on. The first would be culture mapping. Not sure if you all assess the culture or you all help your HR colleagues to assess the culture of your organization, but you need to know the gaps that exist between what people want and what you're delivering. We have done culture mapping research in many organizations, both inside and outside of healthcare. There has not been one yet where our client teams and CEOs and executive leadership teams were not surprised that what they wanted and what they expected from people is not actually what people want in today's workforce environment. So unfortunately, we're trying to solve problems based on dated views of what employees want from us. So mapping culture is a great way to illuminate the reality of what people want today. Defining an employer brand or employee value proposition. We don't really care what people call it. We're flexible on that definition, but each of you should be able to help your HR colleagues and the organization as a whole to explain why people should choose us and why they should stay with us. That is what an employer brand or an employee value proposition is. Many organizations don't have it distilled down to something clear that, a CEO, a nurse leader, everyone can then play back. The other element that we're finding a lot of attention being paid to now is employee experience mapping. We've done a lot of journey mapping, especially from a patient perspective. We're increasingly doing a lot of consumer mapping, which basically says there's a lot that happens before somebody becomes a patient and after they're done being a patient. That's the broader consumer journey. We're doing a lot of work mapping that view. But we're also getting into mapping employee experiences, and it's leading to things like different approaches to interviews, blowing up and restarting our onboarding processes, thinking about different ways that we check in and engage with people as if we're starting with an organization. That's where we can make some really significant impact. And you all, as marketers who have spent time in this mapping space, you have the capability and the experience to bring this to your colleagues in operations, HR, the people side of the business, and bring the expertise that's needed in order to get really precise about things that can be fixed and can be addressed. If you look at the brands that do best on some of these questions around staffing, you see a couple of Miami brands that are listed here. The number one brand in the country overall, Valley Health System, is listed here. But there are some brands that are getting it right. We're currently exploring with some of these organizations a little bit more depth, hopefully to put out an article or a point of view on what some of these organizations are doing right. We will tell you, there's an article published just yesterday in Becker's about Valley Health System and how they put culture, which is a lot of what we're talking about on this employee side, at the center of what they're doing, and has some specific real world examples from the client team there of what they're doing to contribute to that number one overall national ranking. Next topic that we wanted to cover, and I hope I'm not missing any questions. Doesn't look like there are any in the chat at this point, but if there are any, again, feel free to drop them into the chat. Talking about self-care as this new frontier of healthcare, we talked early on from a category engagement perspective around how people want more control. They want to be able to choose what's best for them. And that means they're willing to take on more, to think about more, to tackle more that historically has been the responsibility of healthcare brands. So we have this pull, this orientation to empowerment that can only come in one direction at this stage, and that's people willing to take on things that we have historically done for them. And if you look across the orientation people have to doing their own research around symptoms and treatments, we had a client use this phrase, we can't claim authorship. This is the Dr. Google effect, right? Where people are exploring symptoms and treatments on their own, and they're hungry to take that on. And that has become a pretty significant proportion of total channel usage. You've got people that still prefer in-person care and use it most frequently, but we're up to 42% of people who say that they are managing care themselves through this self-care path. So what does self-care really mean? One of the things that we wanted to explore then were care tasks. Now, this chart, we will be the first to admit, is a little bit silly if you get into the details, but we were using this to make a point. When you think about what people say they are willing to do, the self-serve care tasks, things that we have always done, these are things that people are now saying, I'm willing to take that on. I'll give that a try. We have 70% of people that would take or monitor their temperature, 63% of people that would monitor weight or BMI, that would manage their own blood pressure, that they would record and submit exercise and diet information, monitor their heart rate, submit a urine sample. I mean, these are things, again, that have historically been our responsibility. But we have people saying, assuming that we can deliver it at a high level of quality, that we would be in a position where they would be willing to take this on. So it starts to shift a bit more the dynamic of what we do and where we want to intersect in the lives of the people we serve across our communities. And at this stage, we would be remiss if we wouldn't mention, some of the AI tools. And as an example here, ChatGPT. So as you think about, historically, people went to their physician for advice. Then they went to the physician or the system that the organization represented for advice. There's always been a component where you ask friends and family and social influences. But what if you could aggregate the collective expertise of a whole lot of experts, regardless of where they are, and medical research, and that could be aggregated into more specific care plans? This is a really stupid, simple question posed to ChatGPT, and specificity around what people can start to do to manage. So as we think about the continued proliferation of tools like this, what, if any, role do we want to play within it? Do we embrace things like this, lean into it, and try to intersect with people's lives in different ways? Or do we fight against it or diminish its perceived credibility? Kind of an interesting question to bat around if y'all haven't already. Not surprisingly, this whole orientation to self care is pretty varied across those same segments that we just talked about. So you can see the same set of segments here. Whole health managers prefer this self care channel more than others. You also, interestingly enough, see the doctor dodgers preferring self care. So you start to think about, if we're trying to get the doctor dodgers a little close to it, how might we connect to their self care orientation and build a little bit more of a trusting relationship with them? Might be an interesting path in if we think about some of the tactics that might connect to their orientation to using self care. Let's keep going if we could. Let's talk about language in healthcare. This was another place where we had some client colleagues from Virtua Health in New Jersey that weighed in and helped us think about this particular chapter. We always get into some nitty gritty details in the study, talking about people's preferences for specific content types. So if you start to think about where you're deploying your content currently, um, and the kind of content that you're conveying, those are the two things we'll cover on these pages. In terms of types of content, you see preferences varying here. Everything from at the top, nutritional advice and healthy food recipes, down to general healthcare, general healthcare news, and preference varying across those types. And then what about the channel? So we also think about the format, or where that content is being distributed, where people want to, or at least state that they want to consume that content. And you see some variability here as well. Everything from live radio, which is admittedly at the bottom here, versus getting information through their fitness tracker or wearable. As you mentioned, we collaborated with the team at Virtua Health around content. They do a really impressive job at thinking through content in new ways, everything from the vocabulary around the work that they're doing and the stories they tell, to the places that they deploy it, and the way that they think and rethink and redeploy content. A couple of lessons that we took away from our discussions with them, and this is all outlined even in greater depth in the report, where they co-authored a chapter within Humanizing Brand Experience. But this idea of knowing who you are and just being incredibly consistent about it. If you don't have a brand positioning that's clear, that's the starting point, because that's what you anchor back to. If you feel sometimes that your content is all over the place, it's quite possibly because you don't have that shared anchor point, or perhaps you don't have the most important ingredients that come off of that. A tone of voice that's clear and unique to you, as well as a messaging framework to prioritize who you want to talk to and about what. The next piece is being flexible. This was probably the most interesting takeaway from our discussions with the team at Virtua Health, is the ability to let content and people's response to content guide where it goes next. The back and forth, the almost two-way relationship that this team uses to evolve and apply its content is incredibly interesting and helpful. The other aspect then that Virtua Health does a great job on is ensuring that content has a brand layer to it everywhere. Now, it doesn't have to be 100% intensity everywhere. It's knowing how much intensity is appropriate given the channel or given the message. This is an important aspect that I think other industries, in our experience, do much better than healthcare, is the willingness to modulate where people are open to a brand related message or idea and where they're not. We don't have to make everything 100% intense around our brand. It needs to always be present, but we have to be considerate enough to where people are going to want to see and hear stories from us, and when they just might not be open to it. So a few lessons from our colleagues at Virtua Health that I think reflect the current content world in which we're operating. In addition, we took away a checklist of sorts, and again, we'll have this presentation out to you after today, as well as the recording. So a couple of lessons, we'll just call out maybe one here. because it's the most jarring, perhaps, based on how you've worked in the past. It's the one, two, three, fourth one. Not every piece of content needs to be actionable. This was a shift in thinking um, that Virtual Health illuminated, this orientation to how I want you to feel as opposed to what I want you to do. And it gives a higher level of permission to people to engage with content in different ways and to not be as handcuffed by driving some sort of immediate outcome as they historically have. So definitely mindset shift makes measurement more challenging. We understand, but I think knowing that within your toolbox, you have the opportunity to think about things that are feel related messages as opposed to do related messages was an interesting evolution of thinking. So hopefully you find this checklist helpful. Here are the two nerdiest charts that you will see throughout the course of this presentation. So I'll explain how to interpret this and then give you all a minute just to take a peek at it. We do what's called expectancy analysis, and essentially evaluates preference for each of these content types by segment. So the way to interpret this is whole health managers, if you go to the middle of the chart and then about halfway down, they are most interested in holistic health advice and wellness information that prioritizes staying well to a much higher intensity than the trusting traditionalist to the right. That's what the 12 versus -4 represents. So if you have an existing segmentation model and you see similarities between some of the segments we teed up and your model, this could help you to think about more precisely the content types that your segments want to engage with. If you don't have a segmentation model and you want to apply something like ours that you see here, which we have a number of clients that do across the country, you can apply this thinking and you can better modulate the content type to those individuals. So wait just a minute just so you can pour through the data here. There's a lot of data points. So one more similar chart for those keeping score. We talked content type earlier, but we also talked content format or channel. So you see a similar explanation here around the content formats that people are expecting and how it varies by segment. So let's go to the positive preventatives, the third column. These are folks that are much more oriented to articles posted on general health websites. That's the 12 in comparison to the wellness influencers or the habitual strugglers who basically aren't accessing information through general health websites. So you start to think about where you deploy content. And again, if you're modeling to segment specific behavior, this can make you ever more precise in the work that you're doing. The next piece that we wanted to cover in our discussion here today is this notion of a premium care model. One of the things that we have seen an uptick in is people's willingness to pay more for what they view as the best. There's some ties from this to the loyalty program that we've been talking about, and a lot of exploration among our healthcare clients and the industry as a whole around, is there some kind of pay to play premium model? And what was interesting here is the idea that this might be something that just continues to mask some of the issues that we face across our industry. So as we mentioned, category engagement wise, we're seeing a recovery in people's belief that it's worth the extra cost to go to the best healthcare provider or facility, climbing back up to pre-COVID levels. So somebody might say, oh, okay, how might I capitalize on this, especially in a margin pressured environment in which we're currently operating? If we get a little bit more specific, there are clearly places where people would be willing to invest their dollars. So the question that we asked here is, how willing are you to pay more to receive these kinds of benefits from a healthcare organization? So an advanced level of diagnostic testing, a proactive approach to treating an illness, same-day appointments, 24/7 contactability, extended hours. Interesting when you look at those 3, 4, and 5, right? So same-day appointments, 24/7 contactability, extended hours. It's all about ease and access, right? What's one of the biggest impediments and frustrations that people have in healthcare? Ease and access. So keeping that in mind, we have seen, as you all probably have experienced in your markets, that there is some appetite for, call it concierge medicine, which in many ways is a fee for service um, offering that gets a little closer to some of these types of benefits. Direct primary care, very similar. We've seen some explosive growth outside of traditional healthcare delivery for direct primary care models like a Marathon or an Everside Health as examples. Um, when we look by segment, as you can imagine, those influencers are the ones that are most excited about models like that in comparison with some of the other groups here. Um, but it comes down to a potentially risky bet. I think this gets to something that we've talked to many of our clients about as they explore models like this. Think about that third, fourth, and fifth most important attribute here. What people are basically asking for is just solve the problems that solve the problems that exist right now. And so when you look at why people would be willing to pay more, it's about just addressing the fundamental problems of healthcare. But at the same time, if we create this situation where pay to play becomes even a more significant part of our experience, we're further pulling apart those with resources compared with those who don't or don't choose to spend those resources on healthcare. So there will be some level of further separation between our audiences that might not be worth the risk. So as opposed to investing in creating a premium model that people pay for, is it about investing those time, energy, and dollars into simply fixing some of the ease and access challenges that are reflective of everyone? And maybe that kind of investment in time and energy could better pull people along and further into the healthcare organizations that we're all working to build. So moving into the back end of the work here, we will move to our Humanizing Brand Experience framework and the rankings themselves. We'll share a little bit about the model itself, because this is a quantitative model, specifically a structural equation model that guides all of our work here. It's not influenced by anything other than the data itself. We'll show you the attributes that influence the model and then the performance of brands there. So we look across four different sets of criteria: sensorial attributes, intellectual attributes, emotional attributes, and behavioral ones. And what we have found over time, as this model has continued to become more precise, is that it does explain future behavior. So if we think about, okay, well, what makes this model special? If you focus on delivering against the attributes that are most important here, you will cause more people to choose you, and you will cause more people to advocate for you or recommend you to friends and family. So if you think about that, that's why we're all in this brand experience space, right? Is we want people to choose us more often and to recommend us to others. So a couple of considerations: that predictability is at 74%, which means that 74% of someone's choice is explained by the attributes in this model. That is pretty darn precise, given our experience both inside the healthcare industry and outside of it. There is a weighted moving average applied to brand performance over time. So historically, a brand has to perform consistently to stay at the top of the ranking. So when COVID happened, we did see brands get some disproportionate bumps in their performance. It has come back down to a more reasonable level. So we do apply a weighted moving average there. We do correct all scores based on category engagement. So for example, Miami, that most engaged market, we do adjust all scores based on the level of engagement across the market in which we're operating. So let's look at each of the buckets of drivers first. The overall kind of too long didn't read version of these next 4 pages is that the things that matter most to people from a driver perspective within each of these 4 buckets have not changed significantly over time. And as COVID took hold, we wondered if there was going to be a more significant movement or reprioritization of these attributes. And quite simply, it hasn't happened. The fundamental things that cause people to choose and advocate around healthcare brands has been the same long before COVID and continues to be the same now. So when it comes to the sensorial drivers, those auditory, visual, olfactory cues out there, the ways that people sense your brand, the buzz around it, the environments that you create, and the seeing others use the brand are the top attributes that are there. We often get the question, and maybe we'll just proactively cover it. Paid media, earned media, as an example, is at the bottom here. Not surprising. Consumers always say that they are not influenced by advertising and media, although we know that that's not the case. But that's why those are at the bottom of this list. The intellectual drivers are the attributes that represent kind of that bread and butter of healthcare. Y'all have probably each written 125 different messages or ads that reflect some of these attributes. It is important to call out that best people has always been more important than quality outcomes across the study. And then empathy rounds out the top for those who may represent academic medicine. Academic medicine specifically is not something that consumers understand or understand the benefits around it, and it consistently sits at the bottom among these intellectual drivers. Emotional drivers are the place where healthcare has historically not gotten it right, despite the fact that we're an incredibly emotion rich category. We hesitate to build as much emotion into our brands. Call it the fight with doctors and the prioritization there. Call it a hesitancy to try to kind of allow people to feel associated with why they might choose a brand, whatever the explanation is. You can see that gives me reassurance that they'll be there for me when I need them is consistently the number one most important um, emotional attribute. And freedom, the notion of choice, individualization, feeling like a top priority, those round out the top three this year. Things like celebrating my important milestones and outcomes. So if you all automate a birthday card and not terribly important to people compared with some of these more foundational emotional aspects. Lastly, fourth bucket here and the longest list, these are the behavioral drivers. This is what people do or how they do interact with your brand. So you see a variety of activities, most important of which are positive interactions, uh, improving people's lives, making things stress-free, navigating people to the information that they need, and contactability. Those represent the top 5 attributes this year in terms of those behavioral drivers. So ultimately, we are weighting the importance of these drivers based on what's most important to people. And then we're evaluating more than 200 brands on each of these attributes. Structural equation model then defines the overall score and ultimately informs our brand rankings. The brand rankings are something that we created originally because we didn't see something out in the marketplace that represented a true consumer view. As you all know, probably many of the ranking things that are out there are very limited in terms of the audience or the perspective that is collected. Our rankings are consumer based and don't include, physicians specifically, that kind of thing. So mentioned Valley Health System a bit earlier on. Valley Health System is the number one brand in the country. The reason for it is culture. When you look at their culture and their universal commitment to it, they have done a surprisingly admirable and inspirational job at ensuring that everyone across their organization is oriented to a singular North Star. A lot of organizations talk about that. A lot of organizations say that they do that, but the execution falls a bit flat. Valley Health System is at the top of our list because of that specific orientation. You see some other familiar brands here. Hopkins, as an example, Northwestern shows up again. The Ohio State Wexner Medical Center, University of Wexner Medical Center. But then you see some University of Iowa healthcare that we mentioned, UR Medicine, also in the Northeast, which was a new entrant this year. So again, what we're talking about here is not about whether you're well known or not. It doesn't matter how loud you are. It doesn't matter whether you have a national reputation or not. These rankings are based on the depth the intensity and the richness of the experiential relationship you've created with the people you serve. And Valley Health System has done a better job of that with the audiences that they serve than any other brand in the country. I'll slowly page through the rest of the rankings. As we mentioned, there are more than 200 brands listed here. If you don't have access to the report, we'll make sure that you all have that access. This is where you start to see some of the other brands that you might have expected to see closer to the top, like a Mayo, Mass General Brigham. This is actually the first year that we have reported on that integrated brand as opposed to the two independent hospital brands. Cleveland Clinic comes in at 32, which you can see there. UCSF Health, we mentioned, comes in at 37. This is the next page, 61 through 110. Just leave it up here for a moment. Let's see if there's any to call out. Now you've got 111 through 160 listed here. And then the last page of ranked brands. Okay, a couple of other views to this data, in case it's helpful. We reported on the 10 biggest movers, 22 to 23. And so you see McLeod Health, Northwell Health, making some pretty significant improvements in the rankings here. Sparrow, which this will be the last year that Sparrow is evaluated. They were recently acquired by Michigan Medicine. Emory Healthcare, which you saw listed on one of the top moving brands. Henry Ford Health. This was an interesting one to see because this was after a recent rebrand. So we would anticipate that there's probably going to be some continued improvement there as this organization continues to grow and expand this rebrand expression. The other thing we want to talk about, because many healthcare brands, especially at the top of the list, say, oh, great, here we are. This is fantastic. We have historically collected data about what we describe as disruptor brands. These are brands that are non-traditional in healthcare delivery. Oftentimes are not saddled with a legacy facility footprint, hospital footprint. They're very tech forward brands, often digital only, but Forward and Parsley now have physical spaces as well. What we want to call out here is that all of these brands, all of these startup brands, hopefully some of which you've heard of, maybe they're part of what you do from a mystery shopping perspective. Each of these brands, if we would have put them in the ranking, would have beat Valley Health System. So Valley Health System, in terms of being the #1 traditional healthcare delivery brand in the country, there's a much higher ceiling for healthcare in the minds of our consumers. So before we get too excited about the strength of performance, especially if you're toward the top of that list, we are significantly lacking some of these competitors who are working to address some of the more fundamental issues of healthcare, whether it's accessibility, contactability, some of the things we talked about on earlier pages, but they all would have been the #1 brands in the country if we'd added them into the mix. Would have made Valley Health System #7. So what does that mean in terms of implications and key takeaways? We wanted to share 5 perspectives with you. So if there's kind of some specific actions that you all can be taking, these are the pages where we wanted to share that. One of the things that was an unintended but very beneficial outcome of how healthcare brands worked through COVID was the collaborative orientation across disciplines. Many of our team, myself included, come from outside of healthcare, where collaboration across departments and disciplines is much more common and natural. Think retail, consumer packaged goods. It doesn't happen as naturally in healthcare. I think from our perspective, this working across orientation that emerged as part of COVID response has to continue. You all can't do your jobs just being marketers and just looking at the world through the lens of marketing. You have to find ways to work across. That's with HR, that's with operations, that's with patient experience teams, if those are separate from you all as brand or consumer experience teams. If you're not kind of trying to work across, we're leaving opportunity on the table. The other aspect is y'all are great storytellers. That's why many people are in marketing, is that orientation to storytelling. And you can help tell the stories of other teams and departments and celebrate what's happening there in a way that grows culture and experience internally and has an impact externally. So how do you bring your talents to other parts of the organization in order to drive new kinds of conversations and connections across the enterprise? The second takeaway here, and we saw this one coming, but it feels realist now, and that's that your brand strategy, what you stand for as a brand, has to be rebalanced to focus internal and external. So hopefully this won't be a surprise. You all probably experienced it yourselves very directly when probably 10 or so years ago, everyone in healthcare wanted to be more consumer driven. It was kind of the consumerization of healthcare, right? We all use that word a lot. And healthcare brand strategies and positionings were all built on consumer. And it was almost universally consumer without consideration of other audiences. There has to be a rebalancing happening where our positioning has to be both grounded in our consumer audiences, our communities, but also to our employees. And we're seeing this start to happen gradually. But if you look at your brand positioning, and hopefully that's something that comes immediately to mind for each of you, where is the voice of your employee in it? And if it's not there, this is an incredible opportunity to say, okay, how do we build a more balanced positioning that says, this is why we're special to consumers who need to choose us. This is also why we're special to our workforce, our employees, and this is why they have to stay with us. So I think if we think about the phases of healthcare branding, 20 years ago it was, let's build something that recruits and retains doctors who focus on quality. Then it became, let's shift, and it's about the consumer mindset. This next age is about balancing consumer and employee. And sorry to any physicians that might be tackling or that might be on this or a part of this, or physician-led organizations. Your voice is continuing to become less and less important. But that's critical as our organizations are evolving. The third reflects the learning that we talked about related to UCSF Health and the things we heard from Sarah Sanders, and that is defining systemness to your unique perspective. Why does your systemness matter? And what flavor is it? Because it doesn't have to be monolithic, rigid consistency. It might be about partnership. It might be about a specific kind of connection, let's say an 800 number, a singular place to schedule. That might be the flavor of systemness that you really want to prioritize and then deliver. What's most important is that you take the opportunity to truly think about what systemness means to your organization. The fourth is about rethinking content engine. Many organizations invested a huge amount of time building content engines of different types. They could be more journalistic in orientation. They could be about monitoring and measurement and this ability to quick turn redeployment of content. It's really important to think about the role that our content engines need to play, thinking about the application to different segments and their segment priorities, assuming that you have an active segmentation in place. Building a culture of listening so that you can adapt and change your stories over time. Connecting with HR, again, in the spirit of horizontal connection. We need to always evolve our perspective on the role that content is supposed to play for our organization. And we should be able to specifically answer what role that is pretty precisely if we were pushed on the topic. Lastly, if you're not already doing it, think like a chief customer officer. The age of the traditional marketing leader or brand leader or marketer is shifting so quickly. And the bigger idea in terms of role within the enterprise, and again, this is much more common in other industries, but we tee it up here as an opportunity to think differently, is that you should be taking responsibility to all aspects of experience. That's what chief customer officers do. they're thinking about the care experience and how the product is delivered along with how it's marketed. They're always oriented to thinking through, assessing, designing, and testing amid within a very competitive environment. And they are the individual oftentimes that is championing adaptability, change, flexibility for the organization. They help the organization to learn how to shift, to learn how to reprioritize, and to be comfortable with it. We know that that's incredibly or incredibly uncomfortable, oftentimes in healthcare. But if we don't start to take on a fail forward fast mentality, and we're not talking about failing from a care delivery perspective or from a quality point of view, that's not what we're saying at all. It's the ability to try new things from a marketing, brand, and experience perspective, see what works, see how to improve it, redeploy again. That's what we're talking about from an overall mindset perspective. So you may have seen, you may be representatives of brands that are listed here in the report. If you are and you don't have access to the data, that's something we can provide access to, and we have the opportunity to do so. I assume as follow-up, we'll probably get this document to you, a link to the report, and then the opportunity if you want to be a part of it. If you're interested in getting your own organization into the report for next year, we also add new markets and new brands all the time. Or if you just want to see the data from some of the brands we already collect, that's a pathway as well. But we'd love to have you join the 30 plus organizations across the country that are currently a part of Humanizing Brand Experience. I guess at this point, haven't seen any questions come in via the chat, but we'll open it up as I think we have about 15 minutes left. Any questions that y'all might have? Okay. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to share all of this content with you. We'll get some of the materials out as a follow-up. And if there's anything that we can do to be helpful or any follow-up questions you have, we are easy to find. All right. Thanks so much, y'all. Take care. Have a great rest of your week.